For centuries, societies around the world cooked up a wild idea, taxing people for being single. And yes, women were often the specific targets, or caught in the crossfire of these policies. Imagine getting a bill from the government simply because you had not married. These are not fairy tales. These are real laws, with real numbers, from real history books. Get ready to explore 8 historical spinster taxes and the times that created them. Number 8. Montana's momentary money grab from unmarried men in 1921. In the year 1921, the state of Montana in the United States of America passed a law that caught the attention of many. This law was officially known as House Bill No. 466, but people quickly started calling it the Montana Bachelor Tax. The law required all unmarried men residing in Montana who were between the ages of 21 and 60 years to pay an annual tax. The amount set for this tax was $3. Now, $3 in 1921 might not sound like a huge sum of money to us today. However, it is important to understand its value at that time. In the early 1920s, average wages varied, but for many working men, $3 could represent a portion of a day's pay or the cost of several essential goods. For example, a loaf of bread might cost around 10 cents and a pound of beef, perhaps 25 cents. So, $3 was not an insignificant amount to some. The stated purpose of this tax, as included in the legislative discussions, was to raise revenue for the state. Montana, like many states after the First World War, was looking for ways to fund its public services and manage its finances. This bachelor tax was part of a larger package of new license fees and taxes introduced during that legislative session. The funds collected from this particular tax were to be deposited into the state's general fund, meaning they could be used for various public expenses. However, the discussions and public commentary around the tax often went beyond simple revenue generation. There were underlying social ideas present. In the early 20th century, there was a common societal expectation that men should marry, establish families, and contribute to society as heads of households. Unmarried men, particularly those seen as eligible bachelors, were sometimes viewed in popular culture or local talk as shirking their responsibilities or enjoying a carefree life without the burdens of family. Some proponents of such taxes across different regions, not just Montana, argued that bachelors benefited from the stability and services of a community supported by families without contributing to it, in the same way through raising children or maintaining a household. The Montana Bachelor Tax did not explicitly target women. It was a tax on unmarried men. However, the existence of such a tax and the societal attitudes it reflected had indirect implications for women. In an era where women's economic opportunities were often limited and marriage was a primary path to financial security and social standing, for many, pressures on men to marry could also translate into pressures on women. If society, through measures like a bachelor tax, signaled that men ought to marry, it reinforced the idea that women ought to be married. The availability of marriageable men was a concern, and policies that encouraged men to marry could be seen by some as beneficial to women seeking partners. Conversely, the stigma sometimes attached to bachelors could also, in a roundabout way, affect how single women were perceived or pressured. The law was quite specific about who had to pay. It was for male residents of Montana. There were exemptions. Men who were serving in the United States Army, Navy, or Marine Corps were not required to pay the tax. Also, men who were deemed unable to work due to physical or mental disability were exempt. Tax was to be collected annually by county assessors, the same officials responsible for collecting other property and poll taxes. The life of the Montana Bachelor Tax was, however, very short. It faced opposition and was challenged in the courts. The main legal argument against it was that it was discriminatory because it singled out a specific group of men based on their marital status, and also because it was a poll tax, which some states were moving away from. In November 1922, just over a year after it was enacted, the Montana Supreme Court heard a case, State ex rel. Pierce v. Gowdy, challenging the constitutionality of the tax. Court ultimately struck down the law. The justices found that the tax violated provisions of the Montana Constitution, particularly those related to equality and uniformity in taxation. The court's decision effectively ended the bachelor tax in Montana. It was a notable, if brief, experiment in using tax policy to target a specific demographic based on marital status. While the tax was short-lived, it generated a lot of discussion at the time, both within Montana and in newspapers across the country. Some reports treated it with humor, while others discussed its fairness and practicality. For single women in Montana during that year, the existence of the bachelor tax might have been a topic of conversation, perhaps with mixed feelings. On one hand, it might have seemed like a measure to encourage men to marry. On the other hand, the very idea of the state intervening in such personal decisions through taxation could have been unsettling, regardless of whom the tax directly targeted. The brief episode of the Montana Bachelor Tax serves as a small window into the social and fiscal attitudes of the early 1920s in the American West. Number 7. New Jersey's nixed notion of taxing old maids in 1898. Picture the year 1898 in the state of New Jersey, United States of America. This was a time of industrial growth, societal change, and sometimes rather unusual legislative proposals. In that year, a member of the New Jersey Assembly, a politician named John N. Race from Warren County, introduced a bill that caused quite a stir. His proposed law aimed to impose a special tax on unmarried individuals, specifically targeting bachelors, and notably unmarried women, often referred to at the time by the term old maids. The bill, as reported in newspapers of the day, proposed an annual tax of $10 on every bachelor over the age of 30 years. For unmarried women, the proposed tax was $5 per year, applicable to those over the age of 25. This difference in age and amount between men and women was a common feature in many historical proposals for taxes on the unmarried, often reflecting society views about the appropriate ages for marriage for each gender and their perceived financial capacities. The stated purpose for this proposed tax was quite specific and perhaps intended to lend a sympathetic angle to the bill. Assemblyman Race suggested that the revenue collected from this tax on bachelors and unmarried women should be dedicated to a very particular cause: funding state schools for children who were deaf, dumb, or blind. This framing presented the tax not just as a penalty for being single, but as a means to support a vulnerable segment of the population, potentially making the proposal more palatable to the public and other lawmakers. However, beyond this charitable aim, the introduction of such a bill tapped into ongoing societal discussions and anxieties about marriage, family formation, and population. The late 19th century saw changing social norms, with more individuals, including women, pursuing education or careers, sometimes leading to delayed marriage or choosing not to marry at all. This was a departure from earlier, more rigid expectations. The term old maid, while sometimes used neutrally to describe an unmarried woman, often carried negative connotations of being unwanted, unfulfilled, or even eccentric. Tax, specifically on old maids, would have inevitably reinforced these stigmas. The financial burden of such a tax needs to be considered in context. In 1898, $5 for a woman or $10 for a man was not a trivial sum. For a working-class woman, $5 could represent a significant portion of her weekly or even monthly earnings if she was employed. Many women, especially those unmarried, had limited economic opportunities and often relied on family support or low-paying jobs in domestic service, teaching, or factory work. For a woman struggling to make ends meet, an additional $5 tax for the privilege of being single would have been a hardship. The proposal immediately sparked public debate and commentary, much of it appearing in newspapers across New Jersey and even nationally. The reactions were mixed. Some commentators treated the bill with humor, making jokes about bachelors and old maids finally being made to contribute their fair share. There were satirical articles and cartoons. However, there was also more serious discussion. Some questioned the fairness and constitutionality of taxing people based on their marital status. Others likely felt it was an unwarranted intrusion by the state into private life. For unmarried women of that era, the public discussion surrounding such a bill could have been deeply uncomfortable. To be singled out by a legislative proposal, to have one's marital status discussed as a problem requiring a tax, and to be labeled an old maid in official discourse would have been demeaning. It added another layer of societal pressure to marry on top of existing economic and social incentives. Marriage was often the most viable path to economic security and social respectability for women. Tax on remaining single, even if relatively small for some, would have been a tangible penalty. The bill introduced by Assemblyman Race did not become law. It was debated in the New Jersey legislature, but ultimately it failed to pass. Such proposals often faced significant hurdles, including legal challenges regarding discrimination and practicality of enforcement. Many of these bachelor or spinster tax bills, common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in various American states, were more symbolic gestures or conversation starters than serious legislative efforts destined for enactment. They reflected certain anxieties and desires to uphold traditional family structures, but often lacked broad political support to become actual law. Even though it failed, the 1898 New Jersey proposal is a significant historical example because it explicitly included unmarried women in its taxation scheme and used the term old maids, highlighting the specific targeting and societal views of the time. It reveals how the state could be envisioned as an instrument to enforce social norms around marriage. The debate it generated provides a window into the cultural landscape of turn-of-the-century America and the evolving, often contested roles of men and women within it. The very idea that a woman could be financially penalized by the state for not marrying shows how deeply personal choices were intertwined with public policy and social expectations. Number 6. England's exchequer eyeing bachelors in 1695. In the year 1695, England was in the midst of the 9 Years' War against France, a costly and lengthy conflict. King William III's government was desperately seeking new sources of revenue to fund the war effort. This financial pressure led to the passage of an act with a rather comprehensive title, an act for granting to His Majesty certain rates and duties upon marriages, births, and burials, and upon bachelors and widowers for the term of 5 years for carrying on the war against France with vigor. This piece of legislation is often referred to as the Marriage Duty Act of 1695. While the act imposed taxes on significant life events for everyone, getting married, having a child, and even dying, it also included a specific annual levy on unmarried men. The law stipulated that all bachelors over the age of 25 years and also childless widowers were required to pay a yearly tax. The basic rate was 1 shilling per year. However, the tax was graduated according to social rank and wealth. This meant that a common bachelor paid 1 shilling, but a duke who was a bachelor would have to pay a much higher sum, £12 10 shillings. This sliding scale was designed to extract more money from those who could presumably afford to pay more. 1 shilling was the lowest denomination of silver coin at the time. For a common laborer whose annual income might be around 15 to 20 pounds, 1 shilling represented a noticeable, though perhaps not crippling, expense. However, for wealthier bachelors, the tax could be quite substantial. The aim was clearly to raise as much money as possible for the war chest. The stated reason for this tax was unequivocally financial. To fund the ongoing war with France. Preamble of the Act made this very clear. However, like many such taxes throughout history, there were likely underlying social and demographic considerations, even if not explicitly stated as the primary drivers. The late 17th century in England was a period of some anxiety about population levels, social order, and the perceived duties of citizens. Encouraging marriage and the formation of families was often seen as beneficial to the state, promoting stability and ensuring future generations of taxpayers and soldiers. The Marriage Duty Act of 1695 did not directly tax unmarried women, or spinsters, as they were commonly called. The term spinster, originally referring to a woman who spins yarn, had by this time become the legal and common term for an unmarried woman, particularly one past the common age of marriage. While not directly taxed by this specific act for being unmarried, the existence of a tax on bachelors and childless widowers had significant indirect consequences for women and the institution of marriage. In 17th century English society, a woman's social and economic standing was overwhelmingly tied to marriage. Opportunities for women to earn an independent living were scarce, and spinsterhood often meant dependence on relatives or precarious financial existence. The societal pressure on women to marry was immense. Tax on bachelors could be interpreted in a few ways from a woman's perspective or in terms of its impact on women. On one hand, it might have been seen by some as an incentive for men to marry, potentially increasing the pool of available husbands. If men faced a financial penalty for remaining single, they might be more inclined to take a wife. However, the tax also highlighted the state's interest in private lives and marital status. It reinforced the idea that being married and having children was a public good, and that those who did not conform to this norm, in this case bachelors, could be financially penalized. This societal judgment, even when directly applied to men, contributed to the overall climate of pressure surrounding marriage for both sexes. The act also taxed marriages themselves, which meant that entering into matrimony also came with a new state-imposed fee, ranging from 2 shillings and 6 for the poorest to 50 pounds for a dupe. Collection of these taxes was an administrative challenge. Parish officials were often involved in assessing who was liable. The act was initially intended to last for 5 years, but it was extended and continued into the early 18th century, eventually being repealed in 1706. Its effectiveness in raising revenue has been debated by historians. Wars are expensive, and such taxes were often difficult to collect fully. For unmarried women of the period, the label spinster was becoming increasingly loaded. While some women chose not to marry or were unable to find suitable partners, spinsterhood was often viewed with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Popular literature and social commentary sometimes portrayed spinsters in unflattering ways. The Marriage Duty Act, by focusing on bachelors, did not alleviate the social pressures on women. In fact, by making bachelorhood more costly for men, it could have subtly intensified the expectation that marriage was the natural and financially sensible state for everyone. The insights from this act show a government using taxation not just for revenue, but also as a tool that reflected and potentially reinforced social norms. The fact that it taxed life events like marriage, birth, and burial alongside the status of being a bachelor indicates how closely the state was monitoring and attempting to derive income from the personal lives of its citizens. For women, while not paying a spinster tax under this specific law, the entire framework of the Marriage Duty Act underscored the societal and governmental emphasis on marriage and family formation, an emphasis that profoundly shaped their lives and choices. Number 5. Düren, Germany, and its early take on taxing spinsters in the 1550s. Let us travel back to the mid-16th century, specifically to the town of Düren, located in what is now Western Germany. Around the 1550s, this town implemented a measure that directly targeted unmarried women, a spinster tax. This period, the Reformation era, was a time of significant social, religious, and economic change across Europe. Towns and principalities were often looking for ways to manage their populations, maintain social order, and secure local finances. The details of the Düren spinster tax, like many local ordinances from this far back in history, are not as extensively documented as major state laws. However, historical records and mentions in studies of early modern German social history confirm its existence. Such a tax would have typically been levied on unmarried women who had reached a certain age, an age considered past the usual point of marriage. The specific age threshold and the amount of the tax would have been set by the town council. The stated reasons for such taxes in various German towns during this period were often twofold. Firstly, there was a fiscal motive. Towns needed revenue to fund public works, defense, and administration. Taxing a specific group like unmarried women who were perhaps perceived as not contributing to the town's growth through family formation in the same way married households did could have been seen as a way to broaden the tax base, particularly if an unmarried woman had some independent means or property. She might be viewed as capable of contributing. Secondly, and perhaps more significantly, there were strong social and moral motivations. Early modern society placed a very high value on marriage and the patriarchal family unit. Marriage was seen as the bedrock of social order, a way to channel sexuality, ensure the legitimate procreation of children, and provide a stable framework for economic activity. Unmarried individuals, both men and women, could sometimes be viewed with suspicion or as a potential source of social disruption. For women, remaining unmarried was particularly problematic in the eyes of many communities. It went against the expected Leihkop role for women, which was overwhelmingly centered on being a wife and mother. A spinster tax, like the one in Düren, would have served as a form of social discipline. It was a financial disincentive to remaining single and a clear signal from the authorities about societal expectations. The underlying message was that women should marry. By imposing a tax, the town council was essentially penalizing those who did not conform to this norm. Life for an unmarried woman in 16th century Düren or any similar European town was often challenging. Economic opportunities were severely limited. Most women were dependent on male relatives, fathers, brothers, or husbands, for financial support. If a woman did not marry, her options might include living with her family, if they were willing and able, entering a convent, though this became more complicated in Protestant areas after the Reformation, or trying to eke out a living through low-paid work like spinning, sewing, or domestic service. The term spinster itself, meaning a woman who spins, pointed to one of the few occupations open to them. The cost of such a tax, whatever the specific amount, would have been an additional burden on women who were often already in a precarious financial situation. If a woman had inherited some property or had some small income, the tax would directly reduce her means. If she was poor, it might have pushed her further into poverty or increased her reliance on charity. The societal pressure on women to marry was immense. A spinster tax would have amplified this pressure. It wasn't just about avoiding the tax, it was about avoiding the social stigma and the economic disadvantages associated with being an unmarried woman. The tax was a tangible manifestation of that stigma. It publicly marked unmarried women as different, as a group to be specially levied upon. It is difficult to ascertain how effective such a tax was in either raising significant revenue or encouraging marriage. Local taxes of this nature were often inconsistently applied or difficult to collect. Furthermore, marriage decisions were influenced by a complex web of factors, including dowry arrangements, the availability of suitable partners, family wishes, and personal circumstances, not just a relatively small tax. However, the existence of the Duran Spinster tax in the 1550s is highly significant. Demonstrates that the idea of directly taxing unmarried women is not a new one, and it was practiced at a local level centuries ago. It reflects a mindset where the state or local community felt it had a legitimate role in regulating marital behavior through financial means. It also gauze the vulnerable position of unmarried women in early modern society, subject not only to social and economic constraints, but also to specific fiscal penalties imposed by authorities. These early spinster taxes are important pieces of evidence about the historical relationship between gender, marital status, and the power of the state. They paint a vivid picture of the expectations placed upon women and the consequences they faced if they remained outside the institution of marriage. Number 4. The Roman Empire's rules on who should marry and multiply. Let's journey way back in time to the early Roman Empire. The first Roman emperor, Augustus, reigned from 27 before Common Era to 14 Common Era. During his long rule, he introduced a series of laws aimed at encouraging marriage and childbirth, particularly among the upper classes. These laws are collectively known as the Julian laws on marriage and morality, with the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus of 18 before Common Era and the Lex Papia Papea of 9 Common Era being the most prominent. These laws were not spinster taxes in the sense of a direct annual payment solely for being an unmarried woman. Instead, they created a system of penalties and rewards related to marital status and having children, which significantly impacted both unmarried men and women, as well as childless married couples. The stated reasons for these laws were concerns about a perceived decline in morality among the Roman elite, falling marriage rates, and low birth rates within this same class. Augustus believed that the strength and future of Rome depended on a robust and virtuous aristocracy. He wanted to restore traditional Roman family values and ensure a sufficient supply of men to lead the state and the army. There was a fear that the elite families were not producing enough offspring to maintain their numbers and influence. So, what did these laws actually do? They placed certain legal disabilities and financial disadvantages on those who were unmarried or married but childless. For unmarried men, specifically calebs, meaning bachelors or widowers who had not remarried, between the ages of 25 and 60, the primary penalty was that they were barred from inheriting property or receiving legacies from anyone outside their close family. This was a major disincentive in a society where wealth and status were often passed down through wills. For unmarried women, similar restrictions applied. Women between the ages of 20 and 50 who were unwed, virgins or widows who hadn't remarried within a certain time frame, also faced limitations on their ability to inherit property and receive legacies. Given that women in Roman society, especially in the upper classes, often relied on inheritances for their financial security, this was a serious consequence. The laws also penalized married couples who were childless, known as orbi. They could only receive a portion, often half, of any inheritance or legacy left to them. The idea was clear. The state wanted its citizens, particularly the wealthy, to marry and, crucially, to have children. Conversely, the Lex Papia Papea introduced rewards for those who complied with the state's demographic goals. Men and women who were married and had children received various privileges. For instance, men with children had preferential treatment in political careers. Women who bore a certain number of children, typically 3 for free-born women, 4 for freed women, were granted special rights, such as the ius trium liberorum. This right of 3 children freed a woman from a legal guardianship called tutela mulierum, meaning she could manage her own property and legal affairs without needing a male guardian. This was a significant step towards greater autonomy for women who met the criteria. The impact of these Augustan laws on women was profound. While the laws applied to both sexes, they operated within a social context where women's lives were largely defined by marriage and motherhood. Pressure to marry and procreate became legally enshrined. For a woman of the Roman elite, remaining unmarried beyond the age of 20, or being married but childless, now carried tangible financial penalties. It limited her ability to benefit from the wealth of her wider social circle, and could affect her financial independence. The laws effectively pushed women towards marriage and, once married, towards having children as quickly as possible. There were specific time limits. For example, widows were expected to remarry within 2 years, and divorced women within 18 months, or face the penalties. This put considerable pressure on women to find new partners rapidly if their marriages ended. Enforcement of these laws was complex. There were ways people tried to get around them, such as through fictitious marriages. However, the laws remained on the books for centuries, though their strictness and application varied over time. They profoundly shaped Roman social customs and legal thinking about marriage and family. For unmarried women, often pejoratively termed vidua, widow, but could also imply an unmarried state beyond a certain age if she hadn't married or remarried, or even just an older virgin, life could be difficult. While some women might have valued their independence, Roman society was structured around family units. These laws added a legal and financial layer to the existing social pressures. The state under Augustus made it very clear that it considered the reproductive capacity of its citizens, and particularly its female citizens, a matter of public interest and policy. These Roman laws are a powerful example of how a government can use legal and financial incentives and disincentives to try and shape the most personal aspects of life: whom to marry, when to marry, and whether to have children. They were not a simple spinster tax, but a comprehensive system designed to promote specific family structures, and women were central to this vision, both as targets of the restrictions and as potential beneficiaries of the rewards if they conformed. The echoes of these policies valuing marriage and procreation for the good of the state can be seen in various forms throughout later history. Number 3. Hameln, Germany, and the Jungfernschloss of 1688. The year is 1688. We find ourselves in the town of Hameln, Germany, famous in folklore for the tale of the Pied Piper. Beyond its legendary status, Hameln was a real town with a functioning administration that, like many municipalities of its time, had to manage its finances and maintain social order. In this year, the town authorities of Hameln introduced a specific tax known as the Jungfernschloss. Jungfern is the German word for maidens or unmarried young women. Schoss was a term used in many German-speaking areas for a type of direct tax, often levied on property or income. So, the Jungfernschloss was quite plainly a tax on unmarried women. This places it squarely in the category of a direct spinster tax. The late 17th century was a period where many German states and towns were recovering from the devastations of earlier conflicts, like the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648, and were trying to consolidate their territories and administrations. Needs were often pressing. Local taxes were a primary means for towns to fund their expenses, which could include everything from maintaining town walls and paying for local officials to supporting the poor and the church. The exact details of the Hamon-Jungfern-Schoss, such as the precise age at which unmarried women became liable, the amount of the tax, and whether there were exemptions, for example, for very poor women or those in religious orders, would have been laid out in the local town ordinances. These details are often found in municipal archives. However, the general principle was clear. If you were an unmarried woman in Hamon meeting certain criteria, you owed the town a special tax. The reasons behind the Jungfern-Schoss in Hamon were likely a combination of fiscal necessity and social policy, a common pairing for such taxes. From a purely financial perspective, unmarried women, especially if they had some independent means, perhaps through inheritance or their own small business activities, though the latter were limited, represented a potential source of revenue that the town council could tap. However, the social dimension was probably just as, if not more, important. In 17th century German society, as in most of Europe at the time, marriage was the expected and normative state for adult women. The family household, headed by a man, was seen as the fundamental unit of society. Unmarried women, or Jungfern, who remained unmarried past the typical age, could be viewed as being outside this ideal structure. While some women might remain single by choice, or due to lack of a suitable dowry or partner, their status was often considered anomalous. Tax like the Jungfern-Schoss served as a financial disincentive for remaining single. It sent a clear message from the town authorities that marriage was preferred, and that those who did not marry might be expected to contribute more to the community in other ways, such as through this tax. It could also be argued by proponents that unmarried women, without the expenses of raising a family, might have more disposable income, though this was often not the case, and thus could afford to pay an extra levy. For the unmarried women of Hamon, who were subject to this tax, it would have been an additional financial burden. Economic opportunities for women were restricted. Most women relied on marriage for economic security. Those who remained unmarried often faced a precarious existence, dependent on family, charity, or low-wage labor, such as spinning, weaving, domestic service, or perhaps small-scale trading. Adding a tax on top of these challenges would have made life even harder for many. Beyond the financial aspect, the Jungfern-Schoss carried a social weight. It officially marked unmarried women as a distinct group, subject to special taxation. This could contribute to feelings of being singled out or stigmatized. In a society that already placed immense pressure on women to marry, such a tax was a concrete state-sanctioned reinforcement of that pressure. It is difficult to say how long the Jungfern-Schoss in Hamon remained in effect, or how rigorously it was collected. Local tax ordinances could change frequently, depending on the town's financial situation and the prevailing views of the council members. However, its existence in 1688 is a documented fact that provides valuable insight into the governance of early modern German towns and their attitudes towards gender and marital status. The Hamon-Jungfern-Schoss is an example of how specific and targeted these spinster taxes could be at the local level. Unlike broader national policies, such municipal taxes were often tailored to the particular circumstances and perceived needs of a single town or city. They show how deeply ingrained the idea of marriage as a social duty was, and how authorities were willing to use their fiscal powers to encourage it, or at least to extract revenue from those who for whatever reason did not conform to this ideal. For the Jungfern of Hamon, this tax was a tangible reminder of their status in the eyes of their community and its leaders. Number 2, Frankfurt am Main and its Jungfernsteuer targeting maidens. The city of Frankfurt am Main, a major commercial and financial center in Germany for centuries, also has a history of levying taxes on unmarried women. This tax was known as the Jungfernsteuer, which translates directly to maiden tax, or Spinster tax. Records indicate that Frankfurt implemented such a tax at various times, for example, with notable regulations or reaffirmations occurring in years like 1686 and again in 1726. This shows it was not a fleeting idea, but a recurring fiscal tool. Frankfurt, as a free imperial city for much of its history, had significant autonomy in its governance, including its taxation policies. The city council was responsible for raising revenue to cover the considerable expenses of a bustling urban center. These expenses included public infrastructure, administration, defense, and social welfare. The Rundfunksteuer was one among many different types of taxes employed by the city, such as taxes on property, trade, and consumption. The stated purpose of the Rundfunksteuer was, as with most taxes, to generate income for the city treasury. However, the choice to target unmarried women specifically also reflects deeper social and demographic thinking prevalent in early modern Europe. There was a widespread belief that population growth was beneficial for a state or city, providing more workers, soldiers, and taxpayers. Marriage and the formation of families were seen as the primary engines of this growth. Unmarried individuals, particularly women, past what was considered the prime age for marriage, were sometimes viewed as not fully contributing to this societal goal. The Rundfunksteuer could therefore be rationalized as a way for these women to make a financial contribution in lieu of the contribution made by married women through childbearing and household management within a family structure. Furthermore, there might have been an underlying assumption, often incorrect, that unmarried women without dependents had more disposable wealth. The specifics of the Frankfurt Rundfunksteuer would have been detailed in the city's ordinances. These would stipulate who was liable, typically unmarried women above a certain age. The age threshold was important, as it defined when a Rundfunksteuer was considered to have remained unmarried long enough to be taxed. The amount of the tax could also vary, possibly based on the woman's perceived wealth or social standing, though flat rates were also common for simplicity of administration. There might have been exemptions for women in religious orders, those who were impoverished, or perhaps those with severe disabilities. For an unmarried woman living in Frankfurt in the late 17th or early 18th century, the Rundfunksteuer represented both a financial cost and a social statement. Economically, any additional tax could be a burden. While Frankfurt was a wealthy city, not all its inhabitants were affluent. Many unmarried women had limited means of support. They might rely on family or on their own labor in trades, like sewing, lace-making, domestic service, or small-scale retail. For these women, the Rundfunksteuer, even if modest in amount, would have been an unwelcome expense. Socially, the tax reinforced the strong societal expectation that women should marry. Being subject to a special tax because of one's unmarried status was a public marker. It could contribute to the feeling of being an outsider or failing to meet societal norms. Pressure to marry was already intense, driven by economic necessity, social custom, and religious teachings. The Rundfunksteuer added a fiscal dimension to this pressure. The debates and discussions that might have surrounded the implementation or renewal of the Rundfunksteuer in Frankfurt would be revealing of contemporary attitudes. City council records or citizen petitions, if they exist, could shed light on how the tax was justified by its proponents and perceived by the populace, including the women directly affected. It's plausible that some viewed it as fair while others saw it as discriminatory or an imposition. The effectiveness of the Rundfunksteuer in significantly boosting marriage rates is questionable. Marriage decisions were complex, influenced by factors like dowries, parental consent, availability of partners, and personal choice, far more than by a relatively small tax. However, as a revenue source, it might have provided a steady, if perhaps modest, income stream for the city. Persistence being renewed or recodified over several decades, suggests that the city authorities found it useful enough to continue. The Rundfern store in Frankfurt am Main is a significant example of a direct tax on unmarried women in a major European urban center. It highlights how deeply the governance of personal life, particularly marital status, was intertwined with fiscal policy in the early modern period. It decays the prevailing societal view that marriage was not just a private affair, but a matter of public interest, and that individuals, especially women, had a role to play in fulfilling the demographic and social objectives of the community. For the Rundfern of Frankfurt, this tax was a part of the legal and social landscape that shaped her life choices and her place within the city. It serves as a stark reminder of how states have historically used their taxing power in ways that directly targeted women based on their marital status. Number 1. Maryland's colonial charge on certain single women in 1756. In the year 1756, the British colony of Maryland, in what would later become the United States of America, found itself embroiled in the French and Indian War. This conflict, part of a larger global struggle between Great Britain and France, placed significant financial demands on the colonies to support the war effort. In response to these demands, the Maryland General Assembly passed an act for granting a supply of 40,000 pounds for His Majesty's service. Key and quite unusual component of this wartime fundraising measure was a tax levied not only on bachelors but also quite specifically on certain unmarried women. This Maryland law of 1756 stipulated that a tax should be paid by all bachelors over the age of 25 years. The amount varied based on their wealth. Those bachelors whose estates were valued at between 100 and 300 pounds sterling were to pay 5 shillings annually. If their estate was worth more than 300 pounds, the tax rose to 20 shillings, which was equivalent to 1 pound. Crucially, the act extended a similar tax to unmarried women. It specified that any unmarried white woman that never had a child, who was between the ages of 20 and 40 years, and who possessed a visible estate in land or slaves worth more than 100 pounds, was also subject to this tax. Tax rates for these women were similar to those for bachelors in comparable wealth brackets. If her qualifying property was valued between 100 and 300 pounds, she paid 5 shillings. If it was over 300 pounds, she paid 20 shillings. The explicit inclusion of unmarried, childless white women with property was a remarkable feature of this law. While bachelor taxes were not unheard of, directly taxing unmarried women based on their marital status, age, and property ownership was less common in the American colonies at this time. The requirement that she never had a child also points to a moral dimension, focusing the tax on women who were not contributing to the colonial population through childbirth, either within or outside of marriage, though the primary focus seems to be on their unmarried status coupled with property. The primary stated reason for this tax, and the entire Supply Act, was to raise money for His Majesty's service, that is to fund Maryland's contribution to the war against the French and their Native American allies. Preamble of the act would have detailed these urgent fiscal needs. Colonial governments often resorted to various forms of taxation during wartime, including poll taxes, property taxes, and import-export duties. However, the specific targeting of bachelors and certain unmarried women likely also carried underlying social connotations. Colonial societies highly valued marriage and family formation for population, growth, economic stability, and social order. There was a general expectation that adults would marry and establish households. Individuals who remained single beyond a certain age, especially if they were perceived to have the means to support a family, could sometimes be viewed as not fulfilling their societal duties. Taxing them could be seen as a way for them to contribute financially in lieu of forming a family unit, or as a gentle nudge towards matrimony. For an unmarried woman in colonial Maryland in 1756, this tax would have been a significant matter if she met the criteria. Firstly, property ownership for women, especially unmarried women, was not widespread, but it did occur often through inheritance from fathers or deceased husbands, though this tax targeted women who never had a child, implying they were unlikely to be widows with children, owning land, or, more grimly, enslaved people, valued at over £100, meant she was a woman of some substance. Tax itself, 5 or 20 shillings, was not a negligible amount. 20 shillings was £1 sterling. Average annual wages for laborers were perhaps 20 to 30 pounds. So, for a woman managing her own property, this tax represented a direct cost. The social implications were also noteworthy. The law singled out a very specific demographic of women: unmarried, childless, white, between 20 and 40, and property. The age bracket of 20 to 40 was considered prime, childbearing, and marriageable years. By taxing women in this category, who remained unmarried and childless, the law subtly underscored the societal expectation that women, particularly those with means, should marry and contribute to the colony's growth. The requirement of being childless is also interesting. It avoided taxing unwed mothers who were often already in difficult social and economic positions. Instead, it focused on women who, from the perspective of the lawmakers, were perhaps seen as capable of marriage and childbearing but had not done so. It is difficult to know how many women in Maryland were actually affected by this tax, as it required a combination of being unmarried, childless, within the age range, and owning sufficient property. Records of its collection and any public reaction specifically to the taxation of women are scarce. However, the very existence of the provision in the law is historically important. The Maryland tax of 1756 on certain unmarried women is one of the clearest examples of a direct spinster tax in colonial America. It demonstrates that, under the pressures of war and guided by prevailing social norms, a colonial government was willing to impose a financial levy on women specifically because of their marital status, age, and economic standing. It highlights how women's lives, even their private choices about marriage and family, could become subject to public fiscal policy, especially when the needs of the state were deemed paramount. This law serves as a fascinating and somewhat startling insight into the intersection of gender, taxation, and social expectations in the mid-18th century American colonial context.